shortly. The proceeding will start 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 shortly.
Order, order. Welcome to this session of the Foreign Affairs Committee focused on the current situation in Sudan. Martin, can I ask you to kindly introduce yourself?
I'm Martin Platt. I was the Africa editor at the BBC World Service News until I retired in 2013, and I am now the Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies.
Thank you. Alan.
Hi, I am Alan Boswell, the Horn of Africa Director at the International Crisis Group. We're a global organization, conflict prevention and conflict resolution, headquartered in Brussels.
Perfect. Martin, to kick us off, should we have seen this coming?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that it was increasingly clear that you couldn't have, to use an African metaphor, two bulls in the same field. And, you know, the increasing strength of Hemeti against the army and the SRF as opposed to the army meant that they were really, you know, getting to a point where it was no longer compatible to have them both, in a sense, exercising power. And I mean, you know, the state is supposed to be the only arbiter of armed force, and it was getting to a point where that was no longer the case. And I think that the army just decided that in the end they couldn't really tolerate someone like Hemeti, General Daglo, you know, being in that kind of position any longer.
Thank you. And Alan.
Yes, I would concur with Martin's analysis there. Obviously, there had been escalations. Part of the challenge was that we had seen a number of escalatory moves and escalatory cycles. Just a month earlier, in early March, we had seen a massive escalation that actually required a de-escalation agreement, and for one of these sides, Hemeti, the paramilitary leader, to pull his forces out of Khartoum. So I think one of the reasons this was a bit difficult to predict, although everyone knew that tensions were rising, was because we had seen this cycle of escalation and de-escalation quite a few times. But there was high-level mediation that was being done both on the Sudanese level and on the international level in the days leading up to this. So people were aware that it was getting quite tense. But no, I mean, I think it was hard to predict that, you know, fighting would break out exactly when it did.
Thank you, Chris.
And so where are we at now? Do you want to do just a brief kind of outline of who's in control of what, who's running the infrastructure, all of that kind of stuff? Martin, do you want to start? And then.
Well, the Hemeti and the SRF seem to be in a more powerful position. I mean, I was speaking to somebody this morning, they were saying that they were all over Khartoum. But the problem is that we're concentrating on this as if it's a Khartoum issue. And of course, this is a huge country, and a lot of the fighting is outside of it in the periphery. And I mean, you would have to know literally almost village by village as to who is on top and who is, so to speak, doing well in this conflict. But I mean, both of them have vast quantities of arms and ammunition, and Hemeti had supplementary supplies flown into him from Libya, and that has assisted him in his position. And I don't think it's possible to tell at this stage who is going to get the upper hand in any of this.
Why Libya? Why is Libya providing arms?
Well, with Haftar, in a sense, there's a sort of there are two camps. I mean, you have Haftar, who runs eastern Libya, and he is in bed, so to speak, with the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group is backing Hemeti, and the Hemeti is then, in return, allowing gold to be flown out of from the mines that he controls in Sudan to help pay for Putin's war in Ukraine. I mean, to put it really bluntly.
And you said to me earlier, before we meet, that this is basically a war over gold. Is that right?
Well, that is certainly one of the major issues. I mean, there was an absolutely fascinating little snippet that Bloomberg put out earlier this month. And if I may, I'll just read you this one paragraph, very brief. It says, about 3 dozen Russians from 58 al-Swaraj workers were questioned on accusations of gold smuggling earlier this year. This is a front for the Wagner Group. On accusation of gold smuggling earlier this year, the probe was seen as a potential setback for Moscow's ambitions in the resource-rich North African state. It also signaled an escalation in the simmering power struggle between Sudan's military and a rival militia whose leader has forged close ties with Russia. Well, you don't have to be a genius to know that the person who's forged close ties with Russia is Hemeti.
Alan?
To answer your question about the state of play, the situation has been remarkably fluid. We have seen fighting across the country, Darfur, the north, the east, throughout this war. But I think one of the remarkable things compared to what we thought we'd see if this worst case scenario broke out is we thought we'd see something looking more like all out nationwide conflict. That has occurred, but what actually we're seeing is that both of these forces are very focused on control of Khartoum. This is essentially a battle for Khartoum. They are pulling their forces from other parts of the country to Khartoum. This looks very much like a battle between two men who both ultimately want to be the top dog in Sudan. In terms of who controls what, again, it's very fluid. Most of the reports suggest SAF might have more control at the moment of strategic locations in Khartoum, but as Martin alluded to, RSF has essentially swarmed the capital with tens of thousands of militiamen, and there's been a lot of give and take.
And do you agree with Martin's analysis about Libya and Russia?
We have seen the reports. We don't think Russia right now or Wagner is a major actor in the conflict. We're watching the reports. We have some sources of our own that suggest there might have been some of these cross-border shipments that came from Libya. I think thus far we've actually been surprised that we haven't seen more external involvement in what we've seen so far. But of course, it's impossible to know if we're seeing the full picture. Just to say, for Hemeti, he's also being heavily pressured from the West not to accept any arms from Wagner as well. So it's difficult to say exactly how that would play out.
Okay,
Henry.
Following on from that, would you say that this is essentially a conflict between two individuals and their almost personal ambitions rather than a conflict of ideologies or cultures?
I think there are many things that you can say about it, but I mean, one of them, of course, is that it's personal between the two men. The second is that it is also the so to speak, the traditional divide in Sudanese society, which is between people who live along the Nile and people who live in the periphery. And that has been one, it goes back many, many years. And in a sense, in that sense, you can look at someone like Hemeti represents the periphery, but again, only one section of the periphery because he is actually from, his family comes from Chad, he's a Rezigat, and he is essentially an Arab who was involved in the Darfur massacres, and some of which were straightforwardly racist, quite frankly. And so you can't just say that he therefore represents everybody who's in the periphery, but that is the way it is seen. While as the army is led by people who are traditionalists and, so to speak, represent the traditional system of, going up through the army, coming from the center of the country, and that is one of the major divisions in what you're seeing now.
Thank you very much. Alan, if I could turn to you, is your opinion that this is a coup or is this the start of a civil war?
This looks more to us like the start of a civil war than a coup.
Okay.
I'll just say that we haven't seen clear evidence yet of exactly how it started, and so we wouldn't call it a coup. Yeah.
And just further, Alan, if I may, how does this situation potentially cause instability in the wider region? So Central African Republic, Ethiopia, Libya, Somalia, South Sudan, Libya. Is this likely to cause greater instability in those neighboring states?
Yes, if we don't see this stopped and arrested soon, it's basically guaranteed that we will see this suck in a variety of other armed groups in Sudan. And there are many other armed groups in Sudan who some of whom are rebels, some of whom are community militias, some of whom are aligned to the government. But we've seen remarkable sort of solidarity, mostly for the most part, from those other groups rejecting this war. Everyone, pretty much all Sudanese who aren't these parties, see this as catastrophic and a mistake. If this drags on, we will see this fragment. We will see all sorts of different sort of struggles around the peripheries that will affect Chad, that will affect South Sudan. This will affect Libya, CAR, Ethiopia. These are all places that cannot really afford more instability. I also think if this drags on, the risk is quite high that we will see major external intervention, and this could become a regional war. And that, as we all know, not only makes the situation worse, but makes it a lot harder to resolve once it hits that point. So we've been very focused on seeing how can we get a ceasefire soon, because this, once this gets much worse and much more multi-sided, it'll just become much more difficult to stop.
Thank you. And just finally, if I may, to you, Martin, following on from what you were saying earlier on in terms of the different bases, does the RSF have a regional base that could sustain it if this were to become a longer-term civil war?
I mean, they did grow out of the Janjaweed. They did grow out of Darfur. That is where Hemeti grew his base, and that is where he still gets a lot of his support from. But not only from there. I mean, he gets it from other areas. And I mean, I think I would very much agree with what was said about the spread. Because, I mean, if you look at who are his allies, I mean, one of his allies is the Eritrean government. The President Isaias has had a finger in every one of his neighbors. And he received Hemeti earlier this year. They are very close. And the one thing that links him, Hemeti, and Haftar is their relationship with the Russians. Now, I'm not trying to say this is a Russian plot. I think the Russians fish in, shall we say, stormy seas, to mix a metaphor. And this is a real storm. And the flights of bringing the weapons in to Libya and then from Libya into Darfur have been they've been tracked. They've been shown on satellites. This is not something that that they are available, and so it is the relationship between the region and the internal players that will really see how this develops and how it plays out.
Thank you very much.
Martin, just on that point, so obviously you were talking about how essentially the gold coming out of Sudan is funding Putin's illegal renewed invasion of Ukraine. So I presume hostilities will harm him because it will interrupt the ability to get gold out, or is that not, have we not seen any cessation of that during the last 10 days?
Sudan is such an enormous country, as long as you control the gold mines and control the means of getting them out, I don't think it's going to really stop the flows. And I mean, it's interesting that Bloomberg reckons that only 20% of all gold goes through official means. That leaves a huge amount to go through unofficial means, and we're talking about something like $4 billion. So this is a vast amount of money in a tiny, and I mean, in a country which has a tiny budget. These are the kind of sums of money. And if you put that into then weapons, and it really does make a huge difference. And don't forget that, there are already 3 countries in Africa which are almost completely dominated by the Wagner Group. We're talking about Mali, the CAR, and Libya. I mean, they have a really strong hold. They have a big say in perhaps 9, 10, perhaps more. And they don't just work at the physical level, they work at the social level. They use all the strengths that the Russians have in social media. And they use all of these extremely effectively. I mean, they've actually forced the French to leave Mali, which is an amazing achievement from their point of view.
Thank you. Neil?
Just a quick one, Chair, if I may. Just given the situation on the ground, both right now and in the coming days and weeks, how crucial is reliable, accurate information and the role of BBC World Service, do you think? Well,
as somebody who worked for the BBC World Service for 30 years, I think it's vital. And to be honest with you, the most important bit of it would be the Arabic service, not the English. Although I worked in the English service all that time. But people do rely on it, and they know that it is a trustworthy source, and it's something that goes down generations. It isn't just something that people pick up. And you can walk through a market. I've walked through markets in actually South Sudan, not North, and heard people listening to them, and in fact people coming up to me and saying, "Oh, you're Martin Platt," only because they knew my voice, which is a bit surprising, shall we say.
Wonderful, but
That's fine. Alan, you touched on the ceasefire. Can I ask you what your assessment is of the likelihood of the ceasefire holding? Obviously, although it's in name holding at the moment, obviously there are reports of jets flying over and of interrupted fire. What's your assessment?
The ceasefires to date, because of course they did also agree to a ceasefire for the 3 days leading up to today, they have been patchy. It is correct that we have, that our information is that there has been some breaking of the ceasefire already in the Khartoum area, primarily in Omdurman. And also possibly in West Darfur and in South Darfur. Generally, the feeling among diplomats is that it'll be harder probably to get the army to fully agree. They have been more resistant to the talks than the RSF side has been. But we have to be realistic about the immediate chances of ceasefires because they keep breaking down. So I think the important thing is to just keep pressing towards a ceasefire and hopefully hope one sticks.
Martin, do you have any views on it?
I don't believe a ceasefire until it happens, and this one seems to be very patchy, as Alan was saying. It doesn't sound as if it's holding, except in particular areas. But it's a huge country. In 99% of the country, there's nothing going on, of course. It is so huge. I remember standing on top of a jeep, looking around in Sudan and seeing nothing but grass, not even one tree. That's what the country is like. It is absolutely enormous. So most of the country, nothing will be happening. It is in very specific areas that the fighting is happening where there are key, settlements. But in most of the country, I presume there's nothing going on. And the real struggle for people now, particularly trying to get out of Khartoum, is getting fuel, getting money, and of course, quite a lot of them, their passports are in the safes of the embassies because they would have been looking for visas or looking for renewals. And of course, they can't get them out now because there aren't any staff left.
Thank you.
I was going to ask about Russia, but I think Henry and Alicia have covered that. You talked about the Wagner group and Haftar in Libya and their support for the RSF, but what about Chinese involvement? They're Sudan's biggest trading partner in oil, agriculture, health, infrastructure. They'll have a view, but do they have any influence, and is there any evidence of them having any involvement?
I've seen nothing that suggests that they have any involvement. And while the Russians, for example, would very much like to have a base in Port Sudan, I don't think the Chinese are interested because they already have one in Djibouti. So I don't think there's that kind of pressure. And that was one of the things that Omar al-Bashir, who was overthrown by the current participants in the conflict, was in a sense offering the Russians was a base from which they could operate. And so, I haven't seen anything that suggests any Chinese involvement at the moment.
No evidence of them picking a side at all?
Not that I'm aware of, but I don't know. Let's hear. I'd be interested to hear what Alan said.
We haven't seen any signs of particular Chinese attempts at mediation or picking sides. China has supported the ceasefire calls at the UN Security Council, as has Russia. Actually. And the one thing we've seen interesting from China is the state media or state-aligned media has been blaming essentially U.S. meddling for the conflict.
Thank you so much. Martin, you mentioned there Omar al-Bashir. There are reports that he was broken out of Koba prison over the weekend when there appears to be a mass escape. I'd be very interested in your assessment as to where he sits within all of this and what the risks are of him being out on the loose.
I would assume that he would align himself with the army, but I mean, I'm not in a position to make that assessment. I mean, I genuinely don't know.
Alan?
Yeah, we are following those reports with great interest, but I don't have we don't have any specific intel on that. Just to say, if he was freed and sort of popped up again as a political actor, I think it could be a very strange wild card in the midst of this. I do agree. I mean, I agree with Martin that if he was to choose a side on this, he would definitely end up falling more on the army side, but he could just as well, be on his own side.
It'd be very helpful for those of us who haven't necessarily followed Sudan as closely as we'd have liked. Since he was removed from power, how much of a radicalising figure, a figure that can bring people together, how much did his being put in prison reduce his ability to affect support, to maintain support, to group and rally people? Alan, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, his Bashir and his party have been ostracized and marginalized and have not been given really a platform to continue politicking. There's been quite a lot of accusations from the sort of civilian political elite who were overthrown in this coup, accusing Burhan, the army chief, of essentially rehabilitating the old Bashir regime. So there's a lot of suspicion of essentially a counter-revolution, if you will. But he's not a figure that, for instance, is continuing to have popular support for himself generally, or people rallying to bring him back into politics. I think if he was free, then it would be something you'd have to watch.
And Martin, if you want to add anything on that, but also how the lack of accountability around Bashir impacts on the scenes that are unfolding.
Well, I don't honestly think that people really assumed there was going to be much accountability. I mean, he's been put in jail, but it's been very, shall we say, comfy jail. He hasn't really struggled very much in that position. And I think he's just sort of seen as part of the scene rather than anything else. I mean, the one thing I think that I don't know whether it's anything that you've thought about, but I mean, the slogan is, African solutions to African problems, which people come up with all the time. And the real question is, what is the African Union doing about this, and what are the Arab League doing about it, since they are members of both of those organizations. And, it is really extraordinary that the African Union They have mediators, they have appointed mediators, and the mediators, as far as I can see, haven't done anything. They haven't arrived in the country, they haven't managed to get through it all. They may have tried hard. I mean, it's Djibouti, South Sudan, and Kenya, but they are not on the ground. They're not, as far as I can see, actually involved in this. They may be behind the scenes, but they are not. And the other thing is, you may remember that Britain, along with a lot of other countries, tried to assist the African Union in getting a standby brigade going. And they have been around since 2010. Well, where are they? They're nowhere on the scene. And if anybody was going to intervene in this, it would really probably have to be the Egyptians, who have a really substantial army. But there's no indication that anybody in the region is prepared to lift a finger to really intervene. I don't think there's any appetite to do it. They all are prepared to put a bit of money here or there, whether it's the United Arab Emirates, the Saudis, whoever, but not to actually do the hard lifting, which would turn African solutions to African problems from a slogan into a reality.
Thank you. Chris?
Just, what's your estimation of the humanitarian situation at the minute? And obviously quite a lot of NGOs have effectively stopped operating. How important is it to get them back in full operation?
Well, it's catastrophic. I mean, everything is going down. I mean, people talk about lack of medicines, a lack of water. I mean, the hospitals are not working. I think there was something like 50 hospitals in Khartoum, and only 5 were operating a couple of days ago. Probably it's fewer now. They're running out of everything that they need. It's an atrocious situation. And people are doing what they always do, which is to rely on each other and to flee. And people are already moving in. I think it was 10, 20,000 people have moved into Chad, joining other people who had fled into Chad before. They're moving into South Sudan, and some are moving into Egypt, and some into Ethiopia. So people move out of the country, despite it being so enormous. So I think that's the response. But I think the heroic efforts really are with the doctors and the lawyers groups, the civilians who have been, who were behind the revolution and were trying to persuade the army and the RSF to hand over power to a civilian authority. And those groups are still active and still doing whatever they can in the circumstances. And I think that, if there's if there's anything one can do, it would be to strengthen their hand. I think, is the only way towards some kind of resolution of this crisis. But it's going to be extremely difficult when the men with the guns really rule the streets.
Alan, do you share that view?
Yes, the humanitarian. This is the fastest growing humanitarian crisis from a man-made circumstances that I've ever seen. You've essentially seen within the course of a matter of days a collapse of an entire city, of a greater city of some 10 million people, and that's just in Khartoum, where we have reports from. The humanitarian situation was not good before this conflict broke out. Bashir was overthrown in 2019, partly because the economy was so poor and living costs were so high, and it's only gotten worse since. A lot of economic assistance has been cut off for over a year now as a pressure tool to get the military to hand over. So yes, in Khartoum, you essentially have very spotty electricity. Temperatures are in their 40s. A lot of people are out of clean drinking water, out of food. There's been widespread looting. The RSF fighters have lost a lot of their logistical supply chains and warehouses, which have been bombed, and are doing widespread looting across the city. It's basically a really, really, really terrible situation. Yeah.
Liam.
Just to follow that up, Alan, do you think that there is a likelihood that NGOs are now going to be forced basically to constrain or restrict their support for the work they're doing? I'm conscious that something like 3/4 of the hospitals have already been knocked out. Do you see NGOs basically having to pull back just to safeguard their own people?
Yeah, they already are pulling back. It's just the security situation does not allow for a humanitarian response, especially in a context without any sort of peacekeepers or third party. The UN has talked about forming a hub for humanitarian work in Port Sudan, but that's in a different part of the country. So this is still very early hours of this of what could be a very long civil war. If this continues, I think we'll see the logistics of a sort of humanitarian operation set up. But at the moment, it just hasn't been able to get off the ground because the security situation in Khartoum has not allowed it.
What do you think the consequences are for the risks of famine, disease outbreaks?
Yeah, I mean, we would hope that we could just get a ceasefire soon, so you wouldn't descend into those sort of scenarios. It's difficult to say what it would look like if we continue to have an all-out battle for Khartoum. Already we're seeing Khartoum start to empty of a lot of residents. People who can afford to are getting on buses and trying to flee basically in any direction. Any direction they can. So I wouldn't want to speculate what the long-term consequences would be in terms of potentially famine, but it's an unusual crisis. Normally in these wars, they take place in rural areas. You have, people with their crops destroyed and things like that. This is something different. This is a collapse of a city of millions of people who can't access basic services or food or water. So I think it's just very unusual.
Mm. And Martin, do you think there are things that we could do to at least support refugee flows in neighbouring countries?
Well, we could certainly back the efforts of the UNHCR to try and deal with the influx that's coming. The one other thing I think we have to remember is that there's been a report today that the World Health Organization is saying that a laboratory with viruses in Khartoum has fallen to the RSF, and they're using it as an operational base. And they are extremely worried about what this could do if it really becomes a battleground. Now, I don't know what's in that laboratory and what it might be, but if the World Health Organization is saying it's worrying, I think we should be worried too.
you worried there are pathogens in that lab
I don't
that could be
know.
loosed?
I have no further information about it. I
I
simply
think
saw
we've been
it
told there's
as a
polio
report.
and other diseases such as that.
Thanks, John.
Saqib.
Yeah, just to build on that, I mean, Martin, you spoke about the flow of refugees to countries like Chad. Could you just elaborate, in your view, the impact it's having on the surrounding countries and on infrastructure in places like Chad, or whether there is sufficient infrastructure to take such a load on?
Well, there certainly won't be the infrastructure, and people, but people will make do. I mean, I've been in Chad when there've been an influx of fighting in Darfur, and you suddenly see 50, 80, 100,000 people coming across the border, and onto what is effectively a sand dune, and then people just start making do, and the UNHCR brings in support very rapidly. They are very used to this, and local people come and help in any way they can, although it does cause tensions with local people, and people get by. The other thing that's quite extraordinary is, I remember I think it was the third day that the camp actually in existence, and the first trucks arrived from across the Sahara. People had heard that people were fleeing there, and they thought, there must be some money to make, and they actually brought goods to sell to the refugees, and they were there on the base within, perhaps it was a week, but extraordinary how fast people respond. We tend to look at the Sahara as being a barrier. For many people, it's just a sea to sail in and find something to trade in, and that goes back, of course, hundreds, if not thousands of years. So, people will respond very rapidly. The other thing one mustn't forget is that this is a region that is very used to refugees. Sudan itself, I can't remember how many millions of refugees, but they've had Eritrean refugees for, since the 1960s, and they've been very hospitable to them and have put them up and looked after them, or at least given them a space to live in. Not always satisfactory, but they've given them the space, and I think people will just say, well, this is what happens in the region, and it's not that unusual.
Alan, I don't know if you...
Royston, finally... Oh, sorry. Were you bringing out?
I was going to, if Alan wanted to, but it's fine.
No. So just those with means are traveling to Egypt, which is really the only real stable country, if you will, that you might want to go to if you have a choice within the region. And they're either going to Egypt or they're going to Port Sudan and then looking for to leave Sudan out of Port Sudan. The refugees who will be fleeing into the other countries will be people who probably have no other choice but to go to those.
Royston, final question.
This is not ideological, and it's between two people, both of whom think they should be in charge. How fluid is the situation? Are people moving from the RSF to the military or vice versa?
I haven't seen any indication of that. I think there's a lot of bitterness. As I said, partly it is because they have different constituent elements. One of them is drawn mainly from the periphery, and the other one's drawn mainly from the peoples of the centre and the Nilotic peoples. So I don't think there's a swap over. There may be some. I'm not saying there's nobody.
Mm. Anything, Alan?
Yeah, no, it remains quite fluid in terms of battlefield dynamics, but the lines are quite set. These are very different institutions. SAF has an air force and has this, has a long institutional history, but the RSF is essentially a collection of militias and is run like basically a family corporate empire. From one family and is tightly controlled. So very, very different. Like Martin said, not a lot of crossover. I think where things get fluid is in terms of potential external support, trying to back one of these sides, or if we see one of them essentially kicked out of Khartoum or lose the Battle of Khartoum. And then there's all sorts of scenarios. And depending on how that goes, that's when we could see state collapse or this really expand into a much wider civil war.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you both ever so much. Those were incredibly informative and helpful answers. Can I also thank you for your forbearance with the process of democracy and allowing us to vote. We will suspend briefly while we change who's giving evidence to us, but thank you both ever so much.
The proceedings are currently suspended. The proceeding is 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 currently suspended.
Straight. We're in question 9.
Welcome back to this session of the Foreign Affairs Committee. For those just joining us, we are fortunately not able to contact one of the members of our panel, so we are hoping to continue to try and contact them, but they are in Khartoum, and as we all know, internet, although improved overnight, is still patchy. Dame Rosalind, it'd be grateful if you could kindly introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name's Rosalind Marsden. I'm an Associate Fellow at Chatham House. I was previously the British Ambassador to Sudan, and after that I was the European Union Special Representative for Sudan and South Sudan.
Perfect. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us today. I would love if you could talk us through how you've seen the last week or so unfold, but particularly if you could comment on where you think that leaves us, what is feasible to achieve in the current circumstances. And also, I'd also very much welcome your reflection on the fact that, as you know, in the Foreign Office, the training is always that the Foreign Office officials are the last out the door, and they are there till every last British national has been removed that can be. We'd welcome your views on the fact that the British embassy staff had to be evacuated due to an immediate and severe threat to their lives.
Yes, well, thank you. Well, I mean, I think as your previous panellists have mentioned, it's unusual really to see this major war taking place in the national capital, Khartoum. Sudan, of course, has been plagued by conflict for many, many years, but they've always taken place in the peripheries. People from the peripheries have fled to Khartoum to seek relative safety. So now we're seeing the complete reverse of this really large-scale fighting going on in the capital and people trying to flee out of the capital. As we know from the reporting from the ground, I mean the situation is extremely serious, having dragged now, I think, into the 11th day of fighting. The efforts by the US Secretary of State and partners to broker a ceasefire, to try to give another opportunity to get foreign nationals out, obviously raised some hopes that maybe this time it would hold. And as we're seeing, it's holding here and there in a patchy way, but this is making it extremely difficult and complex for the Foreign Office to try to evacuate British nationals, because they're being advised to make their own way to the assembly point, the evacuation point, somewhere outside Khartoum, and of course trying to get there under their own steam through the streets with full of armed men fighting, and obviously artillery shelling going on. The fighting moving around different parts of the city is extremely hazardous. I mean, one thing I would like to highlight is some of the local neighbourhood resistance committees, these young people who've been driving the revolution. They've been doing their very best to help people in their neighbourhoods, including the foreign nationals, by sharing information about about escape routes, about roadblocks where they are, and how the fighting is moving around. So they've also been being extremely helpful in this process. But I mean, what we're also hearing from the Sudanese side is that many Sudanese are absolutely terrified that once foreign international efforts to get their nationals out have come to an end, then the real fighting will resume, and of course they will be the victims. Now, in terms of the evacuation of diplomats that's taken place before getting out the civilians, I mean, I think what we understand is that the diplomats, like everybody else, were basically locked down in their houses in a very dangerous situation. So they were, with also obviously patchy communications, they were not really able to fulfill their job. They weren't able to get out and meet anyone. They were also simply sheltering in place. So I think there was a feeling that if they were to contribute to helping the rest of the British community, they could probably do so better if they were out of the country. And of course, it was also necessary for the embassy to try to establish how many nationals are in Khartoum and where they are. It seems that these days the embassy doesn't otherwise automatically register all the British nationals, so that has taken some time. But it's good to see that now it seems from today there's been a serious effort to try and start evacuating people. We saw the UN manage to get hundreds of people out over land in a big convoy to Port Sudan, but that was a major undertaking. I think it took 24 hours to get this huge convoy to Port Sudan, but they did get there safely, and I think that was UN international staff and a number of the international NGO workers.
And can I ask, what is your assessment? So the British government has said that they could not or did not assess it to be safe enough to evacuate without a ceasefire in place. Now, many of us had very little confidence that a ceasefire would be put in place. Indeed, the last one held for only 3 hours. What is your view of the position that the British government took of waiting until there was a ceasefire to be able to evacuate?
Well, I think they've changed, the Foreign Office I think has slightly changed its advice in the last 24 hours or so to say that it recognises that some British nationals will be using their own judgment and getting out under their own steam, when it became apparent to everyone that this succession of ceasefires that have been brokered by the international community have not been anything but very, very partially successful. So people are just getting desperate and leaving. Clearly, from the government's point of view, if they were to supervise an evacuation process, they were trying to sort of hoping that there would be a moment when a humanitarian ceasefire could be put in place and safe evacuation corridors could be established that would minimise the risk to attempting this operation. But as we've seen, even with the latest exercise, it still leaves a very dangerous situation. But I think there's a feeling now with people just running out of food and water, the fighting continuing, that people will have to weigh up the risks and at least make an effort to give up people an opportunity to get out and get to an airfield from which they could be evacuated.
And one of the challenges is obviously the British nationals having to make their own way to the airport, the airstrip, as you mentioned, which is incredibly dangerous because there are no diplomatic staff left on the ground. Do you think if we were to find out in the next few days, weeks, that the majority of British nationals have taken it upon themselves to evacuate themselves rather than using and waiting for a British evacuation, would you see that as a failure of the British state?
I think it's a very difficult judgment. Clearly, it's much easier to evacuate 30 diplomats whose whereabouts and to get them out than to try to tackle the evacuation of, we understand, 4,000 British nationals, including dual nationals, 2,000 of which have now registered with the embassy, with the Foreign Office, saying that they would be interested in being evacuated. I think trying to take on that kind of an evacuation operation on that scale, given the intensity of the fighting that was going on, was going to be incredibly difficult. So I can understand why the government was putting its main effort into trying to broker a ceasefire, or at least, if not a complete ceasefire, some evacuation corridors that could be used, because that would obviously have been the safest option. But despite persistent efforts, although there has been some temporary lull in the fighting, as we've seen, which enabled some other countries to get a number of their nationals out, it hasn't so far resulted in a sufficient ceasefire to be able to, I'm sure, to do what the government would like to have done in providing a safer environment for this exercise. And of course, there's also the issue, I think, that's been raised of communication. I think some British nationals obviously saying they've now heard there's an evacuation operation starting, but they're all worried about, will they miss a communication, how they're going to hear what's going on.
And I think just for confirmation for those who aren't aware, the first evacuation flight has successfully landed, but also the travel advice has changed, which is now that British nationals should make their own way to the airstrip, no longer waiting to be called forward. I presume, based on your comments there, that you would agree that that is likely because of the concerns about inability to communicate because of poor telecoms infrastructure.
Well, yes. I mean, because we know that the internet is down so frequently, people, may be worried that if they sit in their houses waiting to get an email from the Foreign Office, that it may not come through. So I think that may be the reason for the change of advice.
And final question from me before I turn to Royston. The US has adopted the position that they will not be evacuating their nationals under any circumstances from Sudan. Can I ask your assessment of that and whether you feel that would have shaped the British government's response in the early days when they too were not confirming that they would evacuate British nationals?
Well, the Americans are saying that they've got something like 16,000 nationals, including dual nationals in Sudan, which is obviously far more than the UK seems to have. But nevertheless, the UK probably has got the second largest number of nationals amongst all the European countries. So I don't know how that fact influenced the British government's decision. Clearly, the US and the UK worked very closely together in the initial decision to evacuate their diplomats, and perhaps to sort of do that first and then see what could be done in the very dangerous situation to help everyone else.
Royston.
I mean, it's a difficult question to ask you, I suppose, being that you're not on the ground now. But do you think that a long-term ceasefire is possible, and what should the UK and its partners do to try and help to bring that about?
Well, I think there are several things I think we can do, which is first of all is to continue to work very hard to try and build up a coordinated international response, a coordinated international coalition to put pressure on these generals, perhaps making clear to them that they will be held personally accountable if they don't abide by the commitments they've made. We need also to work very closely with regional countries who have leverage on one side or the other to exert that leverage, and importantly not to provide any military or financial support to either side. Of course, when it comes to to actually whether first of all, can we get a ceasefire this is going to be more sustainable than what we've seen so far? I think there does need to be. I think the diplomatic efforts do need to be intensified. I mean, we've seen that there has been a limited degree of success that enabled diplomats to be evacuated and some foreign nationals over the weekend. So the hope was that could be built upon. But I think, the UK should be in a good position to exert its diplomatic pressure on international and regional partners, because the UK has been working very closely, obviously with the United States, but also with the US and Norway and the so-called Troika. It's been working in recent months with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the so-called Quad, all of which has been to support the political process to try to move to democratic transition. So I think continuing to work with those countries, with other regional countries like South Sudan, Kenya and Djibouti, which have been mandated by the regional organisation IGAD to try to broker a ceasefire. A lot needs to be done to keep all these efforts together and coherent, so that everyone's giving the same message to the two generals and we don't start having the whole process fragmenting. But we're now seeing a number of countries sort of volunteering to mediate. We've seen Turkey mentioned, Israel, Algeria, and so on. I think it's really important to try to keep this effort coherent.
I was going to ask you about mediation, actually. That was my next question. But Martin mentioned that there was no obvious signs of any Chinese involvement. But perhaps from a mediation point of view, I don't suppose we mind who the people mediating are, as long as they get to a position that we would want to see, which is a ceasefire. Do you think that they would be involved in any of those mediation conversations?
Well, we haven't seen that sort of involvement by the Chinese so far. Of course, during the Bashir era, they had a very close strategic partnership with the Bashir government, particularly during the years when the sort of oil boom years in the first decade of this century. But Chinese interest in Sudan sort of declined quite a bit after South Sudan's independence in 2011, when most of the oil was remained in the south. So China's role in recent years has been more low-key. Chinese companies have taken some interest in Sudan's gold reserves. But so far we haven't sort of seen them really looking as if they're going to volunteer to play a mediation role.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your evidence so far. Given your experience, do you think there were opportunities that's missed by the UK or its partners in trying to stop this conflict developing into violence?
Well, one thing perhaps to preface the answer to that question, one point I wanted to make, which didn't really come out, I think, from your first two panelists, was that I think what we're seeing at the moment is of course a power struggle between two generals, but it's also an attempt to derail Sudan's democratic transition and to return Sudan to the control of the former regime. I mean, this is a point which is being emphasised extremely strongly by Sudan's pro-democracy civilian and political leaders, and they've been sort of warning the international community and indeed the fellow Sudanese for quite some time that the elements of the old regime were trying to widen the rift between the army and the Rapid Support Force because they wanted to destabilise the transition process. And I think therefore that point has to be properly understood by international governments, including the British government, in order to sort of decide to understand the situation properly. There was a very important statement put out about 3 days ago, signed by Sudan's main pro-democratic political parties, many national figures and intellectuals, sort of basically announcing a united civilian front to resist the return of the former regime. I think this statement does need to be taken seriously. We've also seen during Ramadan, we saw some of the members of the former National Congress Party, the ruling party under Bashir, calling for the release of President Bashir from prison, sort of mobilising both their members but also the so-called Islamist shadow battalions. So, I mean, this issue, it's not just a propaganda issue from Hemeti, although, of course, he's using it, but this is certainly a strongly held view by the pro-democracy movement. So, on the one hand, I think the British government and its partners perhaps should have taken those warnings more seriously. The UK was working extremely actively with its partners to support the political process based on the framework agreement at the 5th of December, which would have, and that this was in its final stages to move towards appointing a civilian prime minister, a civilian cabinet and a civilian head of state. And there were high hopes that although the agreement was far from perfect, it was certainly a big positive move in the right direction. But of course, as always with this kind of political process, it's the last stages that are the most dangerous, where the spoilers are likely to step up their efforts. I think, again, there were warnings that this might be the case. I myself wrote an article for Chatham House towards the end of March, sort of highlighting the fact that high-level international intervention was required at that critical moment to increase the pressure, particularly on the two military leaders who were arguing over security sector reform and the issue of how long it should take to integrate the Rapid Support Force into the army. We did see, on the American side, we saw Molly Fee, who's the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, picked up the phone and spoke to Hemeti, to Burhan, and to one of the civilian political leaders. I don't know whether any British ministers picked up the phone as well, but it was at that crucial window, I think, where it was really a case of high-level attention should have been focused on the final stage of the political process. And of course, now that the war has broken out, there's very high-level attention from the British government here and from other governments. But in a way, it's necessary sometimes when you don't have a war, but you're at a crucial stage of a political process. And I think perhaps that's where more might have been done.
And can I just ask, as given the UK government was the UN Security Council penholder, would you specifically have expected them to have done more during that period?
Well, I think the UK managed, in the very early stage of the war, to get a press statement quickly out of the UN Security Council, obviously condemning the fighting, calling for an immediate ceasefire, which, given the current climate in the Security Council with the Russians, I think was quite an achievement. They managed to get the Russians and the Chinese to sign up to this. So I think they did actually use their position as penholder to move quickly to achieve that.
Thank you. Chris?
Just wonder how you think other regional battles that are going on and are different countries in the region seeking more authority, more power, how that is playing out within Sudan?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think the number of countries, regional countries, obviously, that have interest in Sudan, I think perhaps the one I would highlight is Egypt, which has obviously very strong historical links with Sudan going back centuries, but it was also, Sudan was a part of the Anglo-Egyptian condominium in the first half of the last century. They regard Sudan, the Egyptians regard Sudan very much as a national security issue, and policy on Sudan is made by the Egyptian intelligence service rather than the foreign ministry. Egypt has been a very strong backer of the Sudanese army and General Burhan. There are very close links between the two armies. Many of the Sudanese army officers go and train in the Egyptian military academies. Since March 2021, there's been a military cooperation agreement between the Sudanese army and the Egyptian army, and they've been conducting military and air and naval drills. There's also a strong interest on the Egyptian side in trying to keep Sudan as an ally in its negotiations with Ethiopia over the Grand Renaissance Dam, which for the Egyptians is seen as a sort of existential issue from their point of view. And it would seem that the government in Egypt would certainly have a strong preference to see a military officer like Burhan in control in Sudan, rather than a militia leader like Hamiti, and rather than a civilian democratic government, which might not be so easy to influence. It's also been clear that the Egyptians have been intervening in Sudanese political affairs. They invited earlier this year a number of Sudanese political actors to go to Cairo to sort of help to form a broader political grouping, which many Sudanese and some international actors saw as an attempt to create a rather parallel political process to the one that the United Nations, the AU and IGAD were already facilitating with support from the Western governments. So the Egyptians are a major player, but it means they do have leverage, of course, on particularly on General Burhan and the army, and therefore for the UK it's very important to be in very close touch with the Egyptians to try to encourage them to work together with the rest of the international community. The United Arab Emirates are also worth mentioning because they've had close ties with General Hamiti, particularly because of the Yemen war. Hamiti put a big military contingent into the Yemen war on the side of the Saudi-led coalition. The army also has put soldiers in, but not so many. The Emiratis also have an interest in trying to get control of a commercial port on the Red Sea. They have a big interest in Sudan from the point of view of food security. They had just announced a $6 billion investment in a new port on the Red Sea that would be linked to a massive agricultural project. But I don't think the UAE are completely on one side. They've got quite good links also with General Burhan and the army as well. So they've got links with both sides. And then, of course, there's Saudi Arabia, which I think is, if anything, probably more neutral between the two. And it's been with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates that the UK has been working together with the Americans to try and leverage their influence on the military leaders through their huge financial power to try to prevent this escalation that has so sadly gone ahead.
Any Russian meddling?
The Russians, as has been mentioned already, have obviously been trying to expand their footprint in this part of Africa, and Sudan has been one of their target countries. Their interests are primarily trying to secure a Russian naval base on the Red Sea coast, which they had in 2017 negotiated with President Bashir before he was overthrown, and they're still pushing to try to get this agreement to be implemented. But both General Burhan is very well aware of regional resistance to that coming from Egypt and some other countries. They've been working through the Wagner Group closely with the Himiti and the Rapid Support Force, providing, we understand, some training and sort of social media advice. Also working closely in exploiting some of the gold mining operations. And in the UN Security Council, the Russians have tended to always really to protect the interests of the military junta, so to speak, especially after the October 2021 coup, vis-a-vis the civilians. And they've always tended to oppose international intervention. The Russians have also been a major supplier of military hardware to the Sudanese army. And Lavrov was in Khartoum just a couple of months ago. On that occasion, he met both Burhan and Himiti. So the Russians have got links to both sides, which may be one of the reasons why they were willing in the Security Council to at least work with everyone else to call for a ceasefire rather than trying to stoke the fighting.
We're just waiting for the Minister to arrive, so I'm going to try and get two more colleagues in. Henry and Saki, please.
Thank you very much, Dame Rosalind. If the instability continues in Sudan, what impact do you think that will have in terms of greater risk of terrorist recruitment? And what is the impact of that on UK security and foreign policy interests?
Well, if the war continues and sort of spreads into a protracted civil war, drawing in domestic and probably then regional actors, obviously there is a risk that you will have breakdown of law and order, ungoverned space in which there could be potential scope for terrorist groups to move in. This has also always been one of the big concerns. So I think there's obviously the concern that it could lead to a much greater increase in, so to speak, migration, but I think terrorism as well is another issue. In the past, in the early days of the Bashir regime in the 1990s, of course, the National Islamic Front and Hassan al-Turabi actively invited terrorists from all over the world, Osama bin Laden and many others, to Khartoum. So, I think the issue is, do we see elements of that regime, if they were to come back into greater power than they've had for the last 4 years, will that lead to the risk of sort of terrorist groups being allowed to come in?
And we're going to wrap up there, I'm afraid. Thank you ever so much, Dame Rosalind. As I said, sadly we had to cut every session down to half an hour, but I'm very pleased we were able to have that half hour with you. Please do feel free to keep the committee updated as things go on. I'm sure you will have left a part of your heart in Sudan when you'll be there to see how it goes forward. Thank you ever so much. We'll suspend briefly in public just to allow us to change over.
Suspended. The proceeding is currently 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 suspended.
Order, order. Welcome back to this session of the Foreign Affairs Committee, where we are now joined by the African Minister, Andrew Mitchell. Minister, can I thank you, first of all? I know many ministers would probably have said that they were too busy in the crisis centre to come at this time to speak to us, so I am grateful to you for your time. I'd be very grateful if you could start with an update on the evacuation for us and how many British nationals we believe at this time we've managed to get out.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you also very much for agreeing that this will just be a very quick session, and I hope if the committee wants to invite me back in slow time that I might get an invitation. So I apologise to the committee that this is only a sort of 20-minute slot. The position is that the UK is supporting the departure of British nationals from Sudan. We are asking British nationals to travel to Wadi Saida airfield before 8 o'clock Khartoum time today to be processed for supported departure. Seats will be allocated on a priority basis, starting with family groups with children and or the elderly or individuals with documented medical conditions. People should continue to ensure that they have logged locations and contact details with the Foreign Office. We are continuing to work up other options to assist British nationals wanting to leave Sudan, including at other points of exit. Travel within Sudan is conducted at British nationals' own risk, and plans may change depending on the security situation. That is an update, Chair, on where we stand.
Thank you. And do you still believe to be the right assessment not to have evacuated at an earlier point before the ceasefire was in place?
Yes, I mean, we have been in crisis mode now for more than a week. We have at all times been exploring every possible option for all British nationals, and of course for our own embassy staff, to whom we owe a specific duty of care as their employer. And at all times we've been working 24/7. You will remember from your own knowledge of the Foreign Office the way the crisis centre operates. There's a crisis centre now with 200 people, government joined across government at the hip. The Prime Minister has just made a visit to thank our staff in the crisis centre, but they've been working flat out day and night to look after and contact British nationals, and also to make sure that we look at all conceivable options, and every option we try to advance as quickly as we can.
Can I ask, did the US's very early decision that they would not evacuate any of their nationals impact on our decision making?
No, although I have to say that we talk very closely to our long-established partners about those options, so I'm sure there was some cross-fertilisation of thinking, but we made the decision to evacuate the British mission in Khartoum because of the extreme danger that our diplomats were in. As I told the House yesterday, we were really positioned between the two sides. It was extremely dangerous, and we made the decision that we should evacuate them when we did.
Do we have an assessment of how many British nationals have taken it on their own back to try and get themselves out of Khartoum because they didn't believe an evacuation was coming?
No, we have no assessment of that. And of course, you know, there will be British nationals who know the local area and the territory extremely well. And they may have disregarded the advice of the Foreign Office, or indeed have accepted the advice yesterday, which changed from you should stay indoors in safety because it is simply too dangerous out on the streets of Khartoum, as all subsequent events have suggested. So that advice yesterday changed to, if you do decide that you are going to move, you do so very much at your own risk. But I accept there will have been people who know the area very well who will have made that calculation.
Thank you, Chris.
Can I ask you a point that was made by Martin Plout earlier, which was that some British nationals' passports might be in the British embassy safe. What are you going to do about people who turn up unable to be documented?
Well, they should have already been the subject of a call from the Foreign Office, and no doubt will have explained that position. Ultimately, it will be for the officials who are now on the ground there from the Home Office and the Foreign Office running the facility which is processing people to make that decision on the ground. But you know, we have given an order of priority. And that order will pertain. So one would hope that the Foreign Office would already have been aware of these circumstances, and that the RDT would take a reasonable view.
One would hope. It was quite a dangerous sort of assumption.
Well, it's the nature of these things, Sir Christopher. I think that, you know, we've got this clear order in which we're going to seek to evacuate people. There's a 72-hour ceasefire. So far it has held, and we must hope and pray that it continues to do so.
We've heard different views as to whether it's holding, and whether it's holding very convincingly or not. Your view is that it's holding.
I have no recent updates to suggest that it isn't. As you will know, the previous a large number of ceasefires didn't hold at all. This one has certainly held since it started at midnight so far.
And it's possible that an event such as this will lead to significant amount of migration, both to other neighbouring countries and potentially much further on. People might end up coming across in boats, might end up crossing into Europe on a boat, might end up coming through to the UK on a boat. Would they then be deported to Rwanda?
Well, that is, at least at the moment, a hypothetical question. If you turned up at the airstrip in Khartoum seeking to be an asylum seeker, you would not be eligible because you cannot be an asylum seeker from your own country. So I think that is the first and most significant point to make, and I imagine the border force would say that they've got an order of priority that they are allowed to accept, which was the order laid down by the government, and that would mean that they wouldn't be eligible anyway, but you can't be an asylum seeker from your own country.
Can I just ask, Minister, apologies, I hadn't seen it publicly confirmed that we deployed RDT teams. It sounded there like we had.
Yes, they have. They've arrived in the airstrip, and they arrived early this morning, and they are in action there.
Thank you. Jackie, if you want to follow up on that point.
Well, Minister, thank you for your time today and all you're doing. I've got a couple of constituents who are stuck in Sudan at the moment. We've just received information that they think it's too risky because of the fuel shortage to make it to the airstrip. Is there any other avenue for them to get there, or get to the port of Sudan for alternative means?
No, all those, and some have already been evacuated and have left. All those who have come under their own steam. We've adopted actually the same procedure that the Germans adopted successfully yesterday, and they came under their own steam, and we're asking people to do the same.
Liam.
Thanks. Ultigani Abdalal is an NHS cardiologist who has told the Times that he was trying to get in touch with the Foreign Office and others and been greeted by radio silence. The British staff of the Khartoum American School told that they were directed to a Foreign Office website, filled in the forms. They say that they have done everything the British government asked me to do, phoned up, got my name on the consulate list, filled in their forms, but not once did I get a personalised email. The only thing you get is a link to the website that is travel advice about Sudan. Alison Lehtinen, a dual British-Finnish national hit by a bullet in the foot, says that she has been in constant touch through phone and WhatsApp with the Finnish embassy. It has been ignored by UK officials. Many of these people turned to the French in order to escape the country. Do you think that the French are doing a better job at evacuating their citizens than the UK?
No, I don't. I think everyone is going about this in their own way. We have much larger numbers of citizens to take out. I mean, I have enormous sympathy with the difficulties that those British citizens whom you've just read out are facing. But if they contact the Foreign Office, the travel advice is extremely important because it does change, and it changed yesterday, and it's changed again today. So keeping in touch with the travel advice is not an insignificant matter, but we have tried that anyone who is registered with the Foreign Office should receive and has received a message at least once a day. The problem is that the atmospherics in Khartoum hinder that sort of communication. Yesterday there was only 2% internet, and that does make communicating extremely difficult. But in principle, that has been what we have tried to achieve. And I've spent several time on recent days in the crisis centre, and I've seen what our staff are doing so well, both in speaking to and comforting those who are in a state of great anxiety, and I completely understand that. So the system is working, but it is spasmodic, as you described.
So presumably, because we have more nationals to evacuate, we are surging in more evacuation capacity than other countries like France. Do you think that by the end of tomorrow we will have evacuated more of our citizens than, say, the French have?
Well, I think I'm not really going to get into numbers because I could not do so with confidence. But what I can say is that we are, as we have been for the last week, extremely focused on every single conceivable way of extracting our citizens, every single type of help that we can give them. We are exploring other options as well at the moment, but for the moment we are evacuating people from the airstrip north of Khartoum, and that operation so far is going well.
We can't give any assurances of that. What documents are being accepted by means of identity at the airport?
Well, for most of the people who are coming up there, ideally they have already been pre-cleared because they've told us about their documents, and we've been able therefore to tell them to come, and when they come they will be waved through by the officials who are there. But otherwise we are expecting them to have a British passport, and so far I'm not aware of any problems in that process.
If families come with dependents who are not British nationals or British citizens, are they being accepted onto the outbound flights?
Well, there's a categorisation of different groupings. They are the families with children, elder folk, people with medical conditions, and there's a sort of prioritisation order in that respect. If you arrive at the airport with children under the age of 18 who do not have documents, so long as the border force officers who are there are content that you are a family unit, then you will get on the plane.
How are they making that judgment?
How will they?
How are they making that judgment?
Well, they just have to satisfy themselves that if the travel documents are not complete, that the children are who they're told they are, and there hasn't been an issue with that.
And if someone presenting themselves wants to claim asylum because their life is in jeopardy in Sudan, at what stage in this evacuation process should they make that claim for asylum?
As Mr. Byrne will know, you can't make an application from Sudan if you're a Sudanese citizen. So the international regulations that govern these things would not work for you.
So if they make that claim for asylum when they land in the UK, what will happen to their claim?
Well, it will be, it's coming by some other means at the moment. It would be depends how they arrive, but it would be assessed in the normal way.
If they're a Sudanese citizen who has come onto a flight, for example, with a British parent, for example, and they land in this country and they want to claim asylum, will that asylum claim be processed in a normal way?
Well, it's very difficult to conceive how a Sudanese citizen today would arrive by plane from Sudan in the UK.
With a British parent?
Well, they won't get on the flight unless we are satisfied about their documents.
But there may be some who do have a legitimate claim to asylum who are left on the tarmac in Sudan.
Well, I think, Mr. Byrne, we're going round in circles. They do not have eligibility to claim asylum.
Policy.
They do not have eligibility to claim asylum when if they were to come and seek to be evacuated from by the British evacuation mission at the moment.
I think the clarification point is, and I'm aware we've only got 7 minutes left, if somebody comes as a dependent, when they arrive in the UK, what is their asylum status? Because they are not seeking asylum necessarily, they have come as a direct dependent, or would they be required to apply for asylum to be able to stay here in the long term?
Well, if I'm not an expert on this area of law, but if I have understood your question correctly, Chair, if they can get on the flight out of north of the airstrip north of Khartoum, on the basis that they get on that flight, they will be able to be transplane in Cyprus and come to the UK.
Very briefly, to your point about prioritisation though, there will be some British nationals who will be unable to get to the airstrip because they do not have fuel, or because they are so unwell from having not had enough food and drink, or because of medical aid that they haven't been able to access. We do not have diplomats on the ground to go and get them in a convoy. Is the RTD got permission to go and extract British nationals?
No, the RTD is based at the airstrip, and it is from there that they will operate. But I am not aware of all the people who've registered. I'm not aware of anyone who falls into that category.
Minister, the UK is, of course, the pen holder in the Security Council at the UN on Sudan. What are the next steps that the government are planning at the UN on this issue?
Well, you put your finger on the critical point, which is that what is urgently required is a ceasefire for the combatants to lay down their arms and return to barracks, and for the political process, which was moving forward significantly before the second week of April, for that to reassert itself. And Britain will do everything it can through holding the pen at the United Nations. We are in a special position, and we have already exercised that at the United Nations since this crisis started. But we will do everything we can, together with our colleagues at the United Nations, together with our friends and colleagues in Europe, together with the regional powers. The Foreign Secretary has been on the phone to our colleagues in the region ceaselessly since this crisis started, to try and move people towards the possibility and then the actuality of a ceasefire. But that is the critical thing that is required. There is going to be a humanitarian catastrophe there with the position at the moment in terms of food and the humanitarian relief. Most of the humanitarian workers are leaving. And they will not be able to come back until there is a ceasefire and there is some degree of safety on the ground. 5 of them have already been murdered.
Royston.
I understand why you evacuated Foreign Office staff. I've no reason to doubt your intelligence that their lives were in danger. I wonder, though, which is what I thought on the weekend, about the optics of senior cabinet tweeting 1,200 military involved in taking our people out, while British citizens were left in Khartoum wondering what was going to happen to them. So I'm pleased that we now have moved on and things are gathering pace. But do you think that's a sensible way to promote that?
Well, I think that you have to accept that the decision was made. I mean, the Prime Minister chaired a COBRA last Saturday morning at 3:15 in the morning. And I think that gives a feeling of the urgency and the tense, critical complexity of the situation. We then decided that the people for whom we had a very specific responsibility, and I emphasise that the government feels a responsibility for all British citizens in Sudan, but the people who were our own employees, the diplomats, their dependents, people who were in British houses and the residents and the embassy were in sufficient jeopardy for us to know that military operations should be launched, and no government puts lightly the men and women of our military into harm's way, and I pay great tribute to their bravery. So I think the tweet to which you are referring reflects the pride and admiration of the Defence Secretary in the remarkable work that the British Armed Forces conducted, getting all our embassy staff out, bar one who is now out and in Djibouti, getting them all out successfully, and also getting all the troops who were involved in the operation safely back to Cyprus as well.
Chris.
We've heard this afternoon in our evidence two different versions, two different answers to the question, should we have known that this was a possibility? One going, well, it would have been very difficult, but others saying, well, actually, the alarm bells should have been ringing because we knew that this was getting into a very tense moment in the process towards democracy, and lots of people didn't want to go back to democracy. I just wondered, do you think, where do you fall on that spectrum? And if there could have been any alarm bells ringing, wouldn't it have been a good idea to have garnered information about how many British nationals there were in Sudan rather earlier, so that we might have been able to we would have been ready to have put something in place? Well,
on the second point, we only know if people tell us, and quite often British nationals don't tell the embassy, and so the embassy has to make a judgment. And the judgments we have made in terms of British nationals and those with dual passports are in the public domain. On the basis of the first question that Sir Christopher asked me, which is, should we have known? I think that is I think that is very difficult. I mean, I don't. My answer is no. Obviously, there's been work done in the Foreign Office. Keir is a very good ambassador there. And that work monitors and works very closely with the different people involved, in particular, of course, with civil society and the politicians rather than the military. But this is not an ideological battle. This is a battle between two generals for power. There's no ideology involved in this. It's raw power being fought over. And one might have hoped that that would never happen, given the appalling humanitarian jeopardy it has placed so many people in.
What we heard earlier was quite a lot of engagement from other countries outside, wanting to meddle, wanting to, including possibly the Wagner Group, Russia, Libya, Egypt. All of these things were available for us to know. And there's a bit of my mind that's just going, well, did we take our eye off the ball when we know that we have quite a lot of British citizens in Sudan?
I don't think so. We were watching very carefully over the peace process. It did appear to be making progress. One has to remember that throughout most of the time after the British protectorate in Sudan, I think it was, Madam Chair, throughout most of that time there's been a military government in Sudan. So the progress that we were working towards, where there might be a civilian government with huge hopes and the enormous bravery of the people who were standing up for democracy and the political leaders in Sudan, we were very close to them. We knew what was going on, and we hoped that progress would continue to be made in respect of those negotiations. But as I say, I think that we would not have expected that these two generals would have slugged it out in this way on a totally non-ideological issue, let alone deployed heavy weapons in built-up areas.
I just urge you to read the evidence that we've had earlier afterwards. I think it might be quite revealing for you.
I always look at the evidence that is published by the...
Minister, I'm aware that you need to leave us, but we will be taking you up on your offer to come back to us again, and I hope not the near to future. I would also just like to put on record that the hearts and thoughts of this entire committee go out to the people of Sudan, and also to all the British nationals who have caught up and have lived through an unbearably scary few days, and also to put on record our thanks to the staff at the Foreign Office, the MOD, the Armed Forces and the Border Force, and now those RDTs on the ground. We all hope that the ceasefire holds, but also I think we would all urge to try and get as many British nationals out as we can as possible. And just to reiterate to those who may be joining us late, the message is that any British national should travel immediately to the airstrip so that they can be evacuated. Thank you ever so much, Minister. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.